The world does not need to hate you, to underestimate you. It only needs to see uncertainty in the way you carry yourself. A lowered voice, a rushed explanation, a nervous smile after someone crosses a line. Small signals, quiet permissions. And over time, those permissions become the architecture of how people handle you. Not because you lack value, because your behavior has been trained to make that value easier to question. This did not begin as your fault. A system built on obedience taught you to confuse humility with self-erasure, patience with passivity, and maturity with swallowing disrespect gracefully. That programming was installed before you had the language to resist it. But awareness changes the contract. From this point forward, staying small is no longer programming. It is participation. Machiavelli understood that a man is first controlled by the image he holds of himself. Change that blueprint, and the world begins to recalibrate. The version of you that keeps apologizing for space was not born in a single moment. It was assembled, piece by piece. A comment from a parent who called your ambition too much. A teacher who rewarded silence more than clarity. A workplace that praised production but punished territory. A circle that liked your growth only when it remained convenient. After enough repetitions, borrowed architecture starts feeling like personality. You begin to believe you are the quiet one, the patient one, the reasonable one, the man who does not need much. That is how the invisible structure forms. It does not announce itself as control. It arrives as advice. Be humble. Be grateful. Be realistic. Do not make things awkward. Do not think too highly of yourself. Each phrase sounds harmless. Together they build a psychological containment system around the man you might have become. And this is the part that matters. The beginning of that structure was not your fault. A society built on obedience has every incentive to produce men who are easy to process. Low friction, predictable, useful. Polite enough to absorb disrespect without forcing a recalculation. Family systems do the same. They reward the version of you that does not disturb the emotional balance of the room. Schools reward compliance before independent judgment. Companies reward the man who delivers value before he learns to price it. Culture smiles at the man who is productive, agreeable, and unsure of his own authority. That programming was installed before most men had the language to challenge it. So the shame does not belong at the beginning. The beginning explains the wound. It does not condemn the man. But awareness changes the contract. Once the mechanism is visible, the old excuse expires. Remaining inside borrowed architecture after seeing its design becomes participation. Not because the past was fair, it was not, but because power begins when a man stops confusing explanation with exemption. Machiavelli understood that a man governed by another person's assumptions will eventually serve another person's design. The Stoics saw the same law inside the mind. A judgment left unexamined becomes a command. A command repeated long enough becomes character. In the architecture of power, an inherited belief is never neutral if it keeps producing submission. The cost is not abstract. It appears in ordinary rooms. You walk into a negotiation already trying not to seem demanding. You speak with restraint, not because restraint is strategic, but because you fear the room will punish your full weight. You accept partial respect and call it maturity. You let people interrupt because correcting them would expose a standard you have not fully claimed. You over-explain your intentions to people who benefit from keeping you uncertain. And slowly, the world learns the role you are willing to play. People do not need hatred to profit from that role. They only need your cooperation. If you believe conflict makes you difficult, someone will use that belief to cross your boundaries with confidence. If you believe asking for the full measure makes you ungrateful, someone will keep offering fragments. If you believe patience means silence, someone will turn your patience into unpaid delay. The room does not need to defeat a man who has already agreed to understate himself. The correction begins with a power audit, not an emotional confession. The question is not simply, who hurt me? The sharper question is, who benefits from the way I currently see myself? When a man answers that honestly, the borrowed structure starts losing authority. A belief can then be named by its function. I should not make people uncomfortable becomes, I've been protecting other people from the pressure of my full presence. I should be grateful for the opportunity becomes, I have been using gratitude to avoid pricing my value. I am just keeping peace becomes, I have been calling avoidance maturity because it sounds more respectable than fear. From there, the new blueprint has to become law, not a slogan, not a mood, a sovereign internal law. My value does not require permission from people who benefit when I doubt it. My ambition does not need to be softened for insecure rooms. My restraint is chosen, not imposed. My presence is not an apology. That is where borrowed architecture begins to lose its grip. A man does not become sovereign by inventing a fantasy version of himself. He becomes sovereign by identifying the structures that made him manageable, withdrawing consent from them, and installing laws that serve the man he is becoming. The world reads a man faster than most men realize. Before his resume is studied, before his intentions are explained, before his competence is proven, the room has already collected signals. The pace of his entrance, the angle of his shoulders, the way he handles silence, the speed of his answer, the amount of approval he seems to need before his words can stand. None of this is accidental. Human beings measure status before they discuss substance. This is the physics of status. Self-perception does not remain hidden inside the mind. It moves through behavior like current through a wire. A man who believes he is lucky to be included carries a different pressure than a man who believes he belongs by standard. A man who fears rejection speaks with a different weight than a man who can walk away without collapsing. A man who needs to be liked before he can feel respected gives the room leverage before the conversation even begins. This is where capable men quietly undercut themselves. They walk into serious rooms with valuable thoughts, then wrap those thoughts in soft packaging. I just think, maybe this is wrong. Sorry, quick question. Those phrases seem polite, but often they function as status leakage. They prepare the room to discount the statement before it has been heard. Then another man says the same thing with less depth and more command, and somehow the room treats it like leadership. That reflex was not born from nowhere. A culture built on obedience teaches men to be easy to process. Speak softly. Take less space. Be grateful for the seat. Do not disturb the room. That training rewards men for lowering their signal until no one feels challenged by their presence. The beginning was programming, but once the mechanism is visible, continuing to broadcast uncertainty becomes participation. Not innocence, participation. Machiavelli understood that reputation often arrives before proof. The prince who appears uncertain invites challenge before his position is even declared. The same law still operates in modern rooms, offices, negotiations, friendships, relationships. People may claim they are judging ability, but silently they are also measuring what a man appears willing to accept. This is how ability becomes an underpriced asset. Not because the man lacks intelligence, not because he lacks discipline, but because his competence is wrapped in apology. Competence without status architecture becomes labor for someone else's empire. A man can be useful, talented, loyal, and consistent, yet still be handled like a replaceable instrument if his self-image tells the room he is afraid to price himself properly. The signals are rarely dramatic. Instant replies to people who treat access casually. Long explanations for decisions that required no defense. Nervous laughter after a boundary has been crossed. A softened answer when clarity would have carried more authority. Acceptance of vague disrespect because naming it would create friction. Over time, these small permissions create a profile. The room learns where he will fold, where he will chase, where he will explain, and where he will accept less to avoid discomfort. Recalibration does not require theatrical dominance. It requires alignment. Speech becomes slower because valuable words do not need to rush. Weak qualifiers disappear because a sentence with structure can stand without padding. Silence is allowed to sit because silence exposes pressure. When challenged, the sovereign man does not hurry to soothe the room. Pressure becomes information. Discomfort reveals who needs him smaller. The correction is not aggression. It is position. Disagreement can be clean. Time can be taken without apology. Interruption can be met without performance. "I was not finished" is enough. No excess emotion, no long defense. No need to turn a standard into a courtroom argument. If an offer falls beneath the standard is stated, and the room is allowed to reveal whether it can meet it. This is not arrogance. Arrogance is empty expansion. This is alignment between inner image and outer behavior. When a man stops leaking status through fear, the shift is felt before it is understood. The room recalibrates because the signal has changed. Drop a comment right now and type the words, "I no longer negotiate with the lowest version of myself." Most men are taught to organize their lives around goals. A stronger body, a higher income, more respect, more discipline, better relationships. The language sounds serious, but the structure is weaker than it appears. A goal lives in the distance, and distance gives a man room to delay. He can remain undisciplined today while telling himself discipline is coming. He can tolerate weak treatment today while claiming respect is part of the future. Goals allow tomorrow to become a hiding place. A standard works differently. A goal is something a man hopes to reach. A standard is something he refuses to fall beneath. That distinction is not motivational, it is structural. A goal points forward, a standard governs now. It touches morning, conversation, reply, room, habit, boundary, offer. It does not ask how he feels, it defines what is permitted. Most men were never trained to live this way. They were trained to chase approval through achievement, earn the grade, win the title, wait for the promotion, become impressive enough to be chosen. The system teaches a man to place his authority somewhere in the future, as if one more external marker will grant permission to respect himself. Men always trying to earn legitimacy are easier to manage than men who operate from internal law. So the early confusion was not your fault. You were taught to confuse achievement with authority. But once the difference becomes visible, the waiting room loses its innocence. Remaining there becomes a choice. Awareness changes responsibility. Machiavelli did not study men who merely wanted power. He studied men who built systems that preserved it. Desire alone was never enough. A ruler without standards becomes dependent on mood, praise, convenience, and pressure. The same law governs private life. If life is ruled only by what a man hopes to achieve, every difficult week, lonely night, rejection, temptation, or small humiliation can pull him below the level he claims to be pursuing. That is why the standard is the throne, not the goal, the standard. A goal says, "One day I will become disciplined." A standard says, "Chaos does not get to govern my day." A goal says, "One day people will respect me." A standard says, "Access to me is earned now." A goal says, "One day I will be harder to manipulate." A standard says, "Confusion no longer grants other people control over my decisions." One is hope, the other is internal law. And most men do not lack goals, they lack law. That is why their lives remain soft around the edges. They tolerate conversations that drain authority from them. They keep relationships running on old access. They answer messages from people who treat them as optional. They consume noise, then wonder why their mind has no command. They allow one compromise to become a pattern, then rename the pattern as a phase. It is architecture. Without standards, a man is governed by whatever reaches him first: mood, loneliness, approval, desire, convenience, fear of being disliked, fear of being called difficult. The man governed by those forces may appear active, but he is not sovereign. He is reactive, predictable, open terrain. The Machiavellian standard has 4 pillars. First, access. Time, attention, loyalty, energy, and information cannot be available to everyone at the same price. If everyone can reach a man, no one has to value reaching him. Second, behavior. Certain actions no longer belong to his identity, even under pressure. Begging for clarity, performing for approval, rewarding disrespect with continued availability, lowering his price because someone else feels uncomfortable with his value. Third, environment. Certain rooms, habits, conversations, and people become incompatible with the man he claims to be. A sovereign mind cannot be built while being fed low-grade noise every day. Fourth, response. Delay, disrespect, rejection, and provocation no longer control the nervous system. A slow reply does not create pursuit. A sharp comment does not create performance. A closed door does not create collapse. A man with standards does not hand his internal command to every external event. This is where identity becomes serious. Not when it is declared, when it starts costing access to what the old self enjoyed: familiar rooms, weak validation, easy distractions, comfortable people who preferred the previous version. That discomfort is not punishment. It is recalibration. A man becomes sovereign when his standards stop requiring an audience. He does not need to announce the law. He lives by it. He enforces it quietly. And the world begins to understand that casual treatment no longer fits the structure. The old version of a man often wants to be understood by everyone. It feels noble. It feels honest. It feels like maturity. But in the architecture of power, being fully understood by the wrong people is not intimacy. It is exposure. A man can reveal too much of his inner world and mistake that exposure for strength. Plans spoken too early, frustrations handed to the unqualified, private doubts shared with people who have not earned proximity. Slowly, his life becomes too readable. This is the architecture of overexposure. The man who is too readable becomes easier to manage, not because he lacks substance, but because he has distributed the blueprint of his mind to people who were only supposed to receive manners, not maps. They know what approval calms him, what silence unsettles him, what delay makes him chase, what criticism makes him explain. Once people know the controls, they do not need to understand the whole machine. That pattern was not created in isolation. Modern culture praises unlimited transparency as maturity. Families often reward the child who explains himself until everyone feels comfortable again. Workplaces, like the man who communicates everything, reacts quickly and remains constantly reachable. Relationships often call constant access love, even when it is really dependency dressed as closeness. So the beginning was not entirely your fault. You were trained to believe that being open made you safe. But once the cost becomes visible, unlimited access stops being honesty. It becomes liability. Machiavelli understood that men judge heavily by what they are allowed to see. The strategic man does not hide from fear, he selects from judgment. Performance is pretending. Selection is sovereignty. Your full interior is not public property, and not every person close enough to hear you is qualified to receive you. This is where many men leak power. A plan is announced before evidence exists, and the plan absorbs everyone else's doubt. A decision is defended to someone who only questioned it because confidence made them uncomfortable. A next move is shared with the wrong person, and their fear becomes friction inside the mind. An argument continues with someone who is not trying to understand, only trying to reduce the man back into a version they recognize. Silence changes the physics. Not empty silence, controlled absence, the kind that gives a man back his surface area. Distance gives back command. Selective disclosure gives back leverage. The man who is fully known by everyone is often fully managed by someone. The man who reveals himself by layers forces others to slow down, pay attention, and earn information. The consequence of overexposure is quiet but severe. Familiarity without earned respect turns presence into furniture. Present, useful, ignored. People approach with less care because access has become cheap. They expect replies. They expect explanations. They expect softness after crossing lines. They expect the door to remain open because it always has. When access has no price, respect becomes optional. The correction is controlled absence. Plans become private until results give them weight. Decisions are explained only to people with earned authority, real wisdom, or actual stake. Emotional disclosure is reserved for those who have demonstrated restraint, loyalty, and depth. Everyone else receives courtesy, not coordinates. The difference is not secrecy for vanity, it is information discipline. A man who controls disclosure controls the amount of surface the world can press against. When provocation appears, calm does not need to be proven. It only needs to be kept. When misunderstanding appears, clarification is not always required. Misunderstanding can filter the room. Some people only reveal themselves when silence denies them control. Some relationships only show their quality when access becomes selective. This is not coldness for its own sake. It is strategic containment. Silence should not be a wall built from fear. It should be a gate controlled by judgment, open for what is worthy, closed against what only consumes. A sovereign man is selective because access is one of the highest currencies he owns. Once unlimited access ends, momentum becomes harder to interrupt. There is less material for others to use against the next move. Words become fewer, but heavier. Presence gains weight. Absence starts speaking. And the world begins to understand that this man is no longer available for casual consumption. The most difficult opposition in a man's life is rarely the loudest one. It usually does not arrive from the room, the critic, the rival, or the person who underestimated him. It comes from inside the structure. Quiet, familiar, reasonable. It speaks in the language of caution, timing, humility, and restraint. It says the moment is not right. It says the standard is too severe. It says distance may cost too much. It says one more explanation might fix the disrespect. And because the voice sounds like his own, he mistakes it for wisdom. This is the version of you that keeps filing appeals against your own rise. Every time a standard is about to be enforced, it asks for a softer sentence. Every time command is required, it requests more evidence. Every time old access needs to be revoked, it reminds you how uncomfortable absence can feel. The old identity rarely argues like an enemy. It argues like a lawyer. It searches for exceptions. It finds emotional loopholes. It turns fear into language polished enough to sound mature. That internal opposition was not created from nothing. It was assembled from old warnings, old embarrassments, old rejections, and old systems that rewarded safety through smallness. The man who wanted less was praised as humble. The man who stayed quiet was called mature. The man who tolerated too much was called patient. Certainty was treated like arrogance. Distance was treated like coldness. Standards were treated like pride. So the first hesitation was programmed before you understood what it was protecting. The beginning was not your fault, but the continuation is where responsibility returns. Machiavelli understood that no territory can remain stable while internal disorder keeps rewriting the law. The same principle governs the mind. A man who cannot govern his inner court will be governed by whatever pressure reaches him first. Praise will move him. Silence will move him. Rejection will move him. Desire will move him. Guilt will move him. And a man moved that easily does not yet possess himself. He has occupied territory, wearing the appearance of free will. The betrayal of a standard rarely looks dramatic. It often appears as one softer message, one unnecessary explanation, one return to someone who already proved the cost of their access. One more day of waiting for confidence before action. One more compromise renamed as maturity. The old identity survives through small permissions granted in private, not through one collapse, but through quiet exceptions repeated until the structure becomes weak again. This is why insight alone does not transform a man. Insight can create intensity for an hour. It can make the mind feel sharp. It can make the old pattern look exposed. But without enforcement, the old architecture returns by morning. The same people receive instant replies. The same tone gets tolerated. The same decision gets delayed. The same fear gets renamed patience because patience sounds more respectable than avoidance. And then the lesson becomes entertainment. A man feels changed without changing the mechanism. The correction is not self-hatred. It is jurisdiction. The old self can explain where you came from, but it cannot be allowed to govern where you go next. The useful audit begins with evidence. Where is behavior beneath the standard still being negotiated? What is being called peace? The truth becomes clear. Being liked by people invested in your smallness is not victory. It is containment. This is the systematic deconstruction of the version that kept you manageable. Not rejection of the past, precision. Not emotional punishment, recalibration. The old reflex may still appear, but appearance is not authority. The old fear may still knock, but it no longer enters without inspection. The old voice may still speak, but it no longer rules. That is where identity becomes enforcement. Drop a comment right now and type the words, "My standard is law, not a request." This is where the title becomes mechanical. The world does not rearrange itself because a man imagines a better life. It does not bend because he repeats a phrase in the mirror or privately hopes reality will become kinder. Reality responds to repeated behavior. Repeated behavior comes from the image a man holds of himself. When the image changes deeply enough, the pattern changes. When the pattern changes long enough, the environment around him has to recalculate. Most men were never taught this chain. They were given softer language. Believe in yourself. Stay positive. Trust the process. Those phrases may sound clean, but they are too vague to build a sovereign life. They make self-perception sound like a mood when it is actually command architecture. A man was not weak because he failed to dream hard enough. He was trapped because his internal reference point kept producing behaviors that made the trap look normal. The beginning of that trap was programming. But once the mechanism is visible, refusing to change the reference point becomes a decision. The chain is precise. Self-image changes posture. Posture changes presence. Presence changes speech. Speech changes boundaries. Boundaries change access. Access changes relationships. Relationships change environment. Environment changes opportunity. Opportunity changes results. Results, repeated over time, change reality. No mysticism, no decoration. Structural leverage. The physics of personal power applied through enforcement. The old version of a man enters a room asking, silently, Do I belong here? The new version enters with a different question. Does this room meet my standard? The old version waits to be chosen. The new version evaluates whether being chosen by weak rooms is even an honor. The old version reads delay as rejection. The new version reads delay as information. The old version chases clarity from people who profit from ambiguity. The new version lets ambiguity disqualify them. Machiavelli understood that power is not only possession, it is positioning. The Stoics understood that a man's first territory is his own judgment. Combine those laws, and a different kind of man appears, internally governed, externally difficult to move, not loud, not desperate, not performing strength. His decisions carry more weight because the blueprint beneath them has changed. But the first sign of rearrangement may not look like reward. It may look like loss. People may disappear. Invitations may slow down. Familiar conversations may start feeling cheap. Old comforts may begin to feel like a room with no air. That is not failure. It is friction. When a standard rises, everything built to exploit the lower standard starts losing access. The removal feels personal because the nervous system is still attached to what once controlled it. Some people were not connected to the man. They were connected to his availability. Some rooms did not value his depth. They valued his silence. Some relationships did not respect his loyalty. They consumed his lack of boundaries. So when he changes, they do not lose him. They lose the version they could handle. That is why the early stage feels strange. A man is not only building a new life, he is withdrawing his signature from old agreements. The agreement to be easy, the agreement to answer quickly, the agreement to soften truth, the agreement to accept fragments because asking for the full measure made other people uncomfortable. Each withdrawal creates pressure, and pressure exposes the structure. That is the recalibration. Cheap access ends, and consumers fade. Explanations shrink, and unserious people become uncomfortable. Delayed respect is no longer chaste, and weak rooms reveal their poverty. Identity stops being negotiable, and the world has to decide whether it can meet the new structure or remain outside it. What falls away after a standard rises was never built for the next level. The new architecture does not need to be explained to people who preferred the old floor plan. Loneliness is not always error. Sometimes it is only the empty space left after low-quality access has been removed. A man who holds the line long enough becomes difficult to place back inside old categories. The world rearranges slowly, then visibly, around the man who stops offering it the same old handle. This was never about thinking highly of yourself for a temporary emotional lift. That fades. This is about becoming difficult to misread, difficult to discount, difficult to access casually, difficult to move without consent. The world studies what a man repeatedly permits, then builds his life around that permission. If interruption is permitted, interruption becomes normal. If delay is permitted, delay becomes the pattern. If partial respect, partial loyalty, partial truth, and partial access are accepted long enough, the world keeps offering fragments and watching him call them enough. The cost appears in small moments, a softer answer than the truth required, an apology that was never owed, a relationship kept alive by silence, a room treated as an opportunity when it should have been disqualified by how casually it handled him. The beginning of that pattern was not entirely his fault. He was trained to become digestible, trained to be grateful for proximity, trained to call self-erasure maturity, trained to wait for the world to name him before he named himself. But absolution ends where awareness begins. After the mechanism is visible, every act of shrinking becomes less about programming and more about participation. Machiavelli wrote for men who could tolerate reality without asking for it to be softened. And the first reality is this: no man can command the world while still asking permission from the weakest part of himself. The old handle has to disappear. Identity can no longer be negotiable. Value can no longer be explained to rooms that profit from questioning it. Words become fewer than insecurity wants. Tolerance becomes lower than loneliness requests. Construction becomes quieter than the audience can track. Standards come before respect. Because when self-image becomes law, behavior changes. When behavior changes, boundaries change. When boundaries change, access changes. When access changes, environment changes. And when environment changes long enough, reality has to recalibrate. That is how the world rearranges, not through fantasy, through enforcement. If this lesson reached the part of you that is finished being manageable, like this video, subscribe to Leverage Doctrine, and study the next lesson carefully. Not for motivation, for recalibration.